The British Prime Minister stood at his podium in Downing Street on Monday morning and did something his government has spent the better part of a year avoiding. He publicly criticized Donald Trump. Not in the careful diplomatic language of communiques, not through intermediaries or background briefings. Keir Starmer looked into the cameras and called the American president's tariff threats completely wrong. The words landed with unusual weight precisely because of how hard Starmer has worked to avoid saying them. For 12 months, through state visits and trade negotiations and the slow-motion collapse of the transatlantic alliance, the British government has pursued a strategy of accommodation. It has increased defense spending. It has signed technology agreements. It has offered a second state visit to a president most Britons view unfavorably. It has done everything possible to preserve the special relationship while the special relationship was being systematically dismantled. Now that strategy has run into an immovable obstacle. The question is no longer whether Britain can maintain its balancing act between Washington and Brussels. The question is whether that balance was ever possible at all. The immediate trigger was Trump's announcement on Saturday that 8 European nations would face escalating tariffs until the United States is permitted to purchase Greenland. The initial rate of 10% begins February 1st. It rises to 25% on June 1st. The tariffs remain in place, according to Trump's Truth Social post, until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Britain was named alongside Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Finland. The common thread connecting these nations is not their trade policies or their economic relationship with the United States. It is their participation last week in Operation Arctic Endurance, a Danish-led military exercise in Greenland that involves small numbers of troops from each country. Britain sent a single military officer. That officer was dispatched, according to the British government, to assess and work on the risk from the Russians. The deployment was framed as part of NATO's collective defense responsibilities in the Arctic. Denmark had specifically requested Allied participation. The exercise was coordinated within the NATO framework. It posed no threat to anyone, the participating nations stated in a joint response to Trump's tariff announcement. Trump saw it differently. He described European nations as having journeyed to Greenland for purposes unknown. He framed the exercise as opposition to American interests. He responded with economic coercion against some of America's closest allies over a military exercise explicitly designed to counter Russian and Chinese activity in a strategically vital region. This is the context in which Starmer's press conference must be understood. The Prime Minister was not simply objecting to tariffs. He was confronting a fundamental rupture in how the Atlantic Alliance functions. Britain finds itself in a uniquely difficult position. It left the European Union in 2020, severing its closest institutional ties with the continent in pursuit of what proponents called a global Britain, capable of forging its own trade relationships and security partnerships. Central to that vision was the special relationship with the United States. Britain would be America's bridge to Europe, its most reliable ally, its partner in maintaining the liberal international order. That vision depended on an American commitment to the liberal international order. It depended on the United States viewing European security as intertwined with American security. It depended on the assumption that close allies would not be subjected to economic warfare over their participation in NATO exercises. Each of those assumptions has now been tested. Each has failed. Starmer acknowledged as much on Monday without quite saying it directly. He spoke of principles that cannot be set aside because they go to the heart of how stable and trusted international cooperation works. He affirmed Britain's support for the fundamental right of Greenland and Denmark to decide their own future. He said that being pragmatic does not mean being passive, and partnership does not mean abandoning principles. These are not the words of a government confident in its strategic position. These are the words of a government recognizing that the ground has shifted beneath it. The British approach to Trump's second term has been defined by a series of calculated concessions. In February 2025, Starmer announced a landmark increase in defense spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, the largest sustained increase since the Cold War. The announcement came days before his first visit to the Trump White House and was explicitly designed to demonstrate that Britain was willing to lead in boosting Europe's security. In May 2025, Britain signed a technology prosperity deal with the United States, covering artificial intelligence, nuclear energy, and quantum computing. Trump's state visit to Britain in September 2025 was treated as an occasion for maximum diplomatic hospitality. King Charles and Queen Camilla hosted the Trumps at Windsor Castle, with the largest military honor guard ever assembled for a state visit. Starmer referred to Trump as "my friend," "our friend," and spoke of leaders who respect each other and leaders who genuinely like each other. The strategy produced tangible results. Britain secured partial exemptions from some of Trump's tariff policies. Trade talks advanced on reducing duties affecting automobiles and aerospace. Investment pledges from American companies reached $204 billion. The special relationship appeared to be weathering the storm better than most European partnerships with Washington. But the Greenland crisis has exposed the limits of this approach. Britain's single military officer in Greenland was not a provocation. It was participation in a NATO exercise at the explicit request of a fellow alliance member. The tariffs Trump announced are not targeted at specific trade practices or economic disputes. They are punishment for defending the territorial integrity of an ally against American pressure. Starmer's government cannot accommodate this. To accept tariffs as legitimate retaliation for participating in NATO exercises would be to accept that collective defense obligations are conditional on American approval. It would be to accept that the alliance exists not to protect its members, but to serve American interests as defined by whoever occupies the White House. The Prime Minister chose his words carefully on Monday. He did not announce retaliatory tariffs. He said Britain had not reached that stage, and his focus was on making sure we don't get to that stage. He called for calm discussion between allies and promised to keep dialogue open. He indicated he expected to speak with Trump in coming days and emphasized the importance of finding a pragmatic, sensible, sustained way through this. But he also drew a line. The use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. Any decision about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone. That right is fundamental, and we support it. The joint statement issued by all 8 targeted nations was equally direct. Tariff threats undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous downward spiral. The signatories included Britain, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. They affirmed their commitment to standing united and coordinated in response. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen went further. Europe will not be blackmailed, she declared. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson echoed the sentiment. We will not let ourselves be blackmailed. Only Denmark and Greenland decide on issues concerning Denmark and Greenland. These are remarkable statements from nations that have spent decades coordinating their security policies with Washington. They reflect a recognition that something fundamental has changed in the transatlantic relationship, that the rules governing Allied relations no longer apply in any predictable way. The European Union has called an emergency summit for Thursday to discuss a coordinated response. French President Emmanuel Macron has reportedly requested activation of the anti-coercion instrument, a legal mechanism adopted in 2023 to protect European countries from economic pressure by non-EU nations. The mechanism was designed with China in mind. It was not designed to be used against the United States. Britain's position in these discussions is complicated by Brexit. It is no longer a member of the European Union. It cannot participate directly in EU decision-making. It cannot benefit from coordinated EU responses. It must navigate this crisis essentially alone, relying on bilateral relationships and its own diminished leverage. The irony is sharp. Brexit was sold partly on the promise that Britain could forge closer ties with the United States outside the constraints of EU membership. The special relationship would flourish. Trade deals would flow. Britain would be America's preferred partner. Instead, Britain finds itself targeted by American tariffs alongside EU members, but without the collective bargaining power the EU provides. It has one foot in Europe and one foot in the Atlantic, and the ground is crumbling under both. Starmer's challenge now is to chart a path that preserves British interests without destroying the relationships his government has invested so heavily in building. He cannot simply capitulate to Trump's demands. Greenland's status is not Britain's to concede. The principle that allies do not coerce each other economically over NATO exercises is not negotiable. But he also cannot afford a full rupture with Washington. The United States remains Britain's largest single-country trading partner. British exports to America totaled $57 billion in 2023. American investment in Britain runs into hundreds of billions. The security relationship, including intelligence sharing and nuclear cooperation, is foundational to British defense. The tariffs Trump has announced would add new duties on top of existing levies. Britain already faces a 10% baseline tariff on exports to the United States under policies implemented earlier in Trump's second term. The Greenland tariffs would raise this to 20% in February and 35% in June. For British manufacturers, particularly in steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors, the impact would be severe. Starmer indicated on Monday that Britain would not immediately pursue retaliatory tariffs. "My focus is on making sure we don't get to that stage," he said. This is the cautious approach his government has favored throughout the Trump era. It assumes that escalation can be avoided through diplomacy, that reasonable compromises can be found, that the fundamental architecture of the alliance remains intact. That assumption is increasingly difficult to sustain. Trump's Greenland demands are not a negotiating position. They are an assertion of American entitlement to territory belonging to a NATO ally. The tariffs are not leverage toward a trade deal. They are punishment for defending that ally's sovereignty. What diplomacy can resolve this? What compromise exists between American ownership of Greenland and Danish sovereignty? What pragmatic solution preserves both the principle that allies don't seize each other's territory and Trump's stated goal of complete and total purchase? These questions have no good answers. The crisis is not a misunderstanding to be cleared up through dialogue. It is a collision between fundamentally incompatible visions of how the Western alliance should function. Starmer spoke on Monday of Britain's role in keeping dialogue open and working with allies in Europe, NATO, and the United States. But the dialogue he envisions requires good faith on all sides. It requires shared premises about what the alliance means and how members should treat each other. Those premises have been shattered. The British government's position over the coming weeks will be closely watched in European capitals. Starmer has positioned himself as a bridge between Washington and Brussels, a leader who understands both sides and can help manage their differences. That role made sense when the differences were over defense spending levels or trade practices. It makes less sense when one side is demanding the surrender of another's territory. Britain will likely pursue a dual track. It will continue diplomatic engagement with Washington, seeking whatever adjustments to the tariff policy can be obtained. It will simultaneously coordinate with European partners on collective responses, participating in discussions even if it cannot formally join EU mechanisms. It will hope that Trump's position softens, that some face-saving compromise emerges, that the crisis passes without forcing impossible choices. This may work. Trump has reversed positions before. The tariff threats could be leveraged for something else entirely. The whole Greenland drama could fade as new crises demand attention. But it may not work. The tariffs may take effect. Retaliation may become unavoidable. The alliance may fracture along lines that cannot easily be repaired. What Starmer said on Monday matters because it signals where Britain draws its lines. The use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. The future of Greenland belongs to Greenland and Denmark. Being pragmatic does not mean being passive. These are not dramatic declarations. They are measured responses to an unmeasured American policy. But they represent a shift nonetheless. The year of accommodation has produced this moment. Britain bent as far as it could, and now it cannot bend further without breaking. The special relationship has weathered many storms since Winston Churchill coined the phrase during the darkest days of World War II. It survived Suez in 1956, when American pressure forced Britain to abandon its military intervention in Egypt. It survived disagreements over Vietnam, the Falklands, and Iraq. It survived because both nations accepted that the partnership served mutual interests and operated within agreed boundaries. Those boundaries have been transgressed. The question is not whether the special relationship will survive in some form. Two nations bound by language, history, culture, and entwined economies will maintain connections regardless of political conflicts. The question is whether the relationship will retain any special character, whether it will continue to mean anything beyond ordinary bilateral ties between major powers. Starmer clearly hopes it can. His press conference on Monday was calibrated to preserve that hope. He emphasized the relationship's importance, its role in British security and prosperity. He promised to keep it strong, constructive, and focused on results. He avoided the inflammatory language that would make reconciliation harder. But hope is not a strategy. Britain must prepare for the possibility that the relationship it has known for 80 years is ending, that what emerges will be something different and less, that the assumptions underlying British foreign policy since 1940 no longer hold. That preparation has already begun in subtle ways. Britain has accelerated its reset with the European Union, seeking closer cooperation on trade, security, and foreign policy. It has invested in relationships with other partners, from the Indo-Pacific to the Gulf. It has begun the painful process of reducing its dependence on any single ally. These adjustments will take years to mature. In the meantime, Britain must navigate a crisis not of its making, over territory not its own, with an ally that no longer behaves like an ally. Starmer will speak with Trump in the coming days. He will make the case for removing Britain from the tariff list. He will emphasize the investments British and American companies have made in each other's economies. He will invoke the history, the shared values, the common interests that have bound the two nations together. It may work. Trump has shown himself susceptible to flattery and personal appeals. The tariffs may be lifted as suddenly as they were imposed. The crisis may pass. But even if it passes, something will have changed. Britain will have learned that the special relationship provides no protection against American coercion. It will have learned that participating in NATO exercises can trigger punitive tariffs. It will have learned that its most important ally views the alliance as a tool for American advantage rather than mutual defense. These lessons cannot be unlearned. They will shape British policy for years to come, regardless of who sits in the White House or number 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister stood at his podium on Monday morning and said what he had avoided saying for a year. He called American policy completely wrong. He affirmed that principles matter more than pragmatism. He drew a line, however carefully, between what Britain will accept and what it will not. That line has now been drawn. The question is what happens when it is crossed.